Hi, everyone. Okay, we'll get started. Um, it's my total pleasure to welcome you all and many of you back. It's really nice to see so many of you again for seminar 5, Economies, in probably seminar 5. That's co-run by Parapraxis Magazine and the Psychosocial Foundation. And this seminar for this pseudo semester was put together by Wendy Lauderman and Alex Colston and myself. The Psychosocial Foundation is a nonprofit educational organization that exists to advance our understanding of where the social, political, and psychological converge. And it's based here in Oakland, California, but largely on Zoom with all of you. Um, if you're not on our mailing list, you can join it on our website. This website will be beautifully, I should add, relaunching. And currently it is not, not beautiful, but it's about to relaunch. So in addition to our twice annual seminar, of which you're participants with Parapraxis, we hold one-off lectures and book events, and we host short courses, 2 of which will be upcoming in the winter, possibly more in the fall. And we also publish Parapraxis magazine, which you can read here. This seminar will meet every Sunday from now through November, and we'll follow the same format pretty much every single time. We'll meet at this time on Sundays for somewhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours. We'll open with remarks from a presenter who has, as you know, following along on the syllabus, selected texts for us. We'll listen to them and then engage them discussing the texts all together. Questions can be posed directly to the presenter or to the whole group, and we're really happy to have group conversation as well as that kind of back and forth. You should at this point have access to our Google Drive unless you signed up in the last 16 hours. But please send me an email if you don't have it and you need it. I'll put my email in the chat. So with that out of the way, today we begin with Donald Moss, who has the unenviable task, I might say, of wrangling Ratman for us. But he will do it wonderfully, I'm sure, and I will introduce him in 1 minute. First, I just want to offer some words from Wendy and Alex and myself on our overall topic, economies. And then we'll get right to Don. So money is present whenever and wherever psychoanalysts and their patients relate to one another. It can also keep analysts and patients from relating at all, and it does so all the time. Money is notoriously difficult for some people to talk about, as David Kruger argues that psychoanalytic practitioners are not alone in their aversion. Quote, money may be society's last emotional taboo, end quote. Freud acknowledged that in general, some 80 years prior to Kruger's writing, this almost same thing. Analysts, quote, can point that money matters are treated by, quote unquote, civilized people in the same way as sexual matters, with the same inconsistency, prudishness, and hypocrisy, end quote. It must be said that Freud himself was not exempt. Brenda Berger and Stephanie Newman have argued more recently in their book, Money Talks, that only the American financial crisis of 2008 finally made money a broachable topic of conversation, both in analytic theory and on the couch between analyst and patient. And we can trouble that. It's not exactly true, but they argue that it took the literal financial landscape collapsing all around us to let it enter the consulting room in the US. It is in just moments of material and national crisis when psychoanalysts are so unsure of their own practice's future that the frame of the frame shifts and becomes newly available for evaluation and view. But this reframing of psychoanalysis and its basic exchange of money for the hour has been with the practice, of course, since its inception, and hasn't been limited actually only to a question of its materiality. Psychoanalysts from Freud on have had 2 economies, even when they can't see it or have naturalized it. Like we will see perhaps with Freud's discussion of Ratman's governess, the way classes just appeared and then disappeared. I digress. It's those two economies and their intersection that we're going to look at in this seminar, often retailed as the problem between Marx and Freud, or one of the great intractable problems of critical theory in the 20th and indeed the 21st centuries. This seminar seeks to grapple with those two economies together. So we know that psychoanalysis costs us something. When we pay to work in any given session, we justify a very curious demand. I have to pay to talk. How could it be justified to pay someone to listen? And through this seminar, we're going to move from Freud's first and earliest thinking about money through to the kind of classic libidinal economy and political economy approaches to economics, and then come back to a kind of braided set at the end of readings and presentations on kind of political and libidinal economy now. And that's what we're going to do in the seminar, look at economics as libidinal and economics as political, both at once. So now to introduce Donald Moss. Donald Moss has been a psychoanalyst in New York for 40 years and was most recently the recipient of the Haskell Norman Prize for Excellence in Psychoanalysis. He sits on many, many boards and of journals, as well as the college executive of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. He's a member of the Holmes Commission on Racial Equality in the American Psychoanalytic Association, and he's the author of many books, including Psychoanalysis in a Plague Year, At War with the Obvious, 13 Ways of Looking at a Man, and he's the editor of Hating, Abhorring, and Wishing to Destroy, as well as Hating in the First Person Plural. I'll drop those links in the chat now. He's currently at work on a book tentatively titled On Having Whiteness and Other Psychoanalytic Provocations. Please help me welcome Don to discuss rat with us.
Okay. Can we fix the screen a little bit so that I see, 40 little squares. Can I get individualized?
You can just change it to speaker view on yours, Don.
Don,
Yeah,
is
I
this
don't see
better
it.
for you? Unpinned?
No, I don't, no, I'm sorry. I have to bring 3.4 Kronen to the post office before we get this thing going. I don't know how to do this.
Okay, so
Because
Let Wendy talk you through it.
the top right corner says view.
Go for it.
Okay, I'm going to go for it. Now I see Hannah. Okay, sorry for the mess, everybody. Well, I also, not exactly sorry, but I was trying to imagine what it might be like for you. I looked through through your names and images as you were emerging, and it looked like, unless you're very unfamiliar to me in the profession, it looked like most of you are not psychoanalysts. And here you are being faced with reading this, probably the most, what's the word for it? The most dense case history in the history of psychoanalysis, dense with information that is packed into this most condensed form. And I've read this case a number of times, and this time, maybe even more than the other times, as I was reading it, I was starting to feel a kind of madness in myself. I thought that the text was making demands on me that I couldn't meet. I couldn't do it. I couldn't follow it. I would get a little bit along and then have to go back and think about Cronin and the lady and the governess and the father. And it was finally, I think, an impossibility for me. So when I finished, right, especially toward the end, when Freud offers what he calls the solution to the rat complex, that's when I kind of fell apart. I couldn't hold it together. And I tried to slow down and see what it was that I couldn't hold together. And I think he pulls together at least a dozen elementary particles of infantile sexuality into one symbol, the rat. And I was trying to, penis, anus, eating, giving birth, male pregnancies, anal sex, transference, the persistence of infantile sexuality, biting, orality, money, females, all in 4 pages or so, and all stored in the body of a rat. And it was more than, it was too much. And I don't know what the word is. Well, did what I just did. I kind of shook my head, and I looked out the window. And out the window, we're up in the country. Out the window are some wildflowers, and it was windy, and the flowers were blowing. And I looked at the woods, and I thought, oh, tranquility. And then in a second, the tranquility of the flowers and the woods, what would be the word for it? Kind of fell apart. The unit, the singularity of what I was looking at fell apart, and it fell into parts. And suddenly, instead of seeing flowers and trees and leaves and wind, I was seeing penises and anuses and eating and giving birth and male pregnancies and sex. That is, I could see instantly that that my capacity to look outside and see one unified percept, that capacity was challenged, and I could see the seams, the sort of the seams that suddenly were illuminated by the proximity of Freud's text. And the seams revealed to me, I think, the same, what would be the word for it, the same underlying elements that Paul, the rat man, was dealing with, and that Freud condensed into this one figure of the rat. And I thought, oh, so when you first read The Rat Man, at least I think, you feel something like I felt, and maybe almost any reader would feel, how crazy it all is, how impossible and overstuffed he is, that is Paul, and Freud might be, this kind of overstuffed, mad, sort of Agatha Christie, but in a very crazed Agatha Christie way. You're going to try to figure out the mystery and pull all the elements together. And at first you think, oh, thankfully I am not like Paul. He is a case, maybe even an extreme case. And then, though, you look out the window at your tranquil, or you wouldn't even have to be tranquil, at your familiar environment, and suddenly, if you're like me, the familiarity and solidity of that environment is exposed as a, not a fabrication, but as a constructed whole. And it's quite discomforting to recognize that it is constructed rather than given. And suddenly you become aware that that which appears to be given might in fact be constructed. And if that's the case, then, or to me at least, when you feel that that's the case, you suddenly feel on quite unstable ground. And in a way, you want a psychoanalyst. You want somebody to listen to you talk about the unstable ground that you might feel yourself to be kind of trying to stand on. And you want somebody to listen as you describe the usually obscured elements of this construction. And if you start feeling that way, then suddenly, I'm using the word suddenly a lot. I can't tell whether it's sudden or gradual, which would be an obsessive concern. But either suddenly or gradually, you start, I think, feeling like, oh, Paul here, the rat man, and I are, from a formal point of view, you know, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. You could say Paul, c'est moi. Or maybe more to the point, Paul, c'est nous. Because what Paul, I think, is dealing with is a little bit maybe more fragile than us, but a set of realities of which he is more aware than we are usually of the fragments that may go together in making up this reality, and he lives more than, maybe more, or differently than we do, in a world of fragments rather than in a world of wholenesses. Not so much that he lives in that world, but he perceives the fragments and suffers from that perception. And I think when he goes to an analyst for help, he's essentially going to say with the request that the analyst help him forge wholenesses out of fragments. And I think when I read Paul this time, I think what happened to me is that reading Paul helped me illuminate fragments that are usually obscured by constructed wholenesses. So, well, that would be my way of starting. I put my notes up on the screen. I'm not happy with the view. Speaker view, gallery view is everybody, right? I'm sorry, this.
Yes. It's again
Okay.
a fragment versus whole.
Yeah, I see Hannah and Donald Moss is one of the small squares in the corner, and Hannah's the occupying the screen. I wish that were. I mean, Hannah, it's very nice to see you, but anyway, it's not a big
Don,
problem.
does this help? What I just did?
No, it's the same. Okay, I'll keep going. All right. So I want to start there. I mean, I have started there. And I want to build on some of the elements in Hannah's introduction, which was, of course, very nice. And especially, I want to say a word or two about the Freud-Marx dimension that Hannah alluded to in her introduction. Maybe some of you probably know this book, The Political Unconscious, Frederick Jameson. And I want to just go there for a second or two. Jameson famously writes, everything in the last analysis is political. And what I want to do in the way that I want to speak about the Rat Man is to speak about everything in the Rat Man being political, not only political in the sense that Hannah alluded to, you know, with the ways governesses are talked about, but in more, how can I say, psychoanalytically political or politically psychoanalytic. That is how unconscious fantasy is structured in political dimensions. So let me read something from Jameson that I think that can help us link Freud to Marx. Jameson writes, there's a single fundamental theme for Marxism, the collective struggle to wrest a realm of freedom from a realm of necessity. So the struggle for Jameson and for Marx is collective, wresting a realm of freedom from a realm of necessity. I think when we think about Paul, the Rat Man, we can sense the exact same struggle that he is engaged in, an effort to wrest a realm of freedom from a realm of necessity. The difference, of course, is that for Marx, the entity wresting a realm of freedom out of necessity is the collective, and for Freud, the entity wresting a realm of freedom from necessity is the individual. But you can see, I think, that that's what Paul is trying to do. He's trying to find his way toward freedom, and he is caught by necessity. He can't get free of necessity. But I think you might be able to sense in his anguish, in his symptoms, each of them, an effort to find freedom, to sort of push through necessity, and he can't do it. And of course, Freud has a way of theorizing what makes him incapable of doing it. And his incapacity to do it is his incapacity to gain access to, again, I'm going to go to Jameson. What Jameson writes is, in restoring to the surface the repressed and buried reality of this fundamental history. This is the task for Marx, restoring to the surface the repressed and buried reality of a fundamental history. And I think you can see for Paul, that's what and with Freud's help really, that's what they're engaged in trying to do. So it's nice to be thinking that for Marx, this effort to escape necessity toward freedom by way of restoring to the surface repressed and buried realities. And for Freud, the language is a little bit different, but the task is identical, restoring to the surface a repressed and buried reality of a fundamental history. And this is, we don't have to reach very far at all into Freud's case history, this is what he's trying to do, exactly this, restore to the surface the repressed and buried reality of Paul's fundamental history. Okay. I want to say a few more introductory remarks and then pause before we get to some of the details of the case. What I want to do is try to offer from elsewhere in Freud some of how Freud theorizes instability. Let's see if I can put this otherwise. Paul's troublesome case begins with sexual fantasies. So what we need to do is try to get a clearer idea of what makes sexual fantasies so troublesome for Paul and so troublesome and so destabilizing. And the way I would like to do that is to begin with Freud's idea of the drive, the sexual drive. And he conceptualizes the sexual drive as a demand on the mind for work made by the body, a demand on the mind for work. And this demand takes place across what Freud calls a frontier. And this is the most elemental term in Freudian psychoanalysis, the drive. And this most elemental term is a term grounded in the notion of work. The body makes a demand for work on the mind. So immediately, even at the level of the drive, one can see exchange. I'll speak as though I'm the body. I make a demand on you to satisfy me. So my body is the source of demand, and my mind is the vehicle through which that demand is either met or evaded. So from the beginning, there is an exchange and an economy at the frontier between body and mind. And this set of exchanges is non-stop. The moment I comply with the demand for work and the body has its chance to rest, shortly thereafter, a new demand emerges, and newer ones. And so I am in a position of, fielding continuous demands from my body in a situation that never stabilizes. So I want to emphasize that Freud begins with a profoundly unstable beginning. We're grounded in this instability to the extent that we're grounded in our bodies and in the drive. Okay, that for me will be the first frontier to pay attention to. The second one begins here with Freud, and I'll read something from Freud that I think is really important. At first, the human organism is incapable of bringing about its own satisfaction. It can only take place by extraneous help, when the attention of an experienced person is drawn to the child's state by discharge, crying. In this way, the path of discharge acquires a secondary function, communication, And the initial helplessness of human beings is the primal source of all moral motives. So from the instability of the drive, the body making a demand on the mind, comes this second frontier, the mind making a demand on the external world by way of a cry. By way of crying, I demand your help. And Freud says that cry is what he calls the primal source of all moral motives. And of course, that cry is a site of exchange between myself and the external world, a site of economics, that is, and a political site. What power does my cry have? What power do you have to either respond to it, or to ignore it? There is a relation, there is a political relation established immediately between I who am crying and you who are hearing my cry. So this, I think, is a second frontier, which is economic, exchange related, and political. Body to mind, cry to the external world. And then from my cry, which is a kind of inchoate, unformed, and perhaps without particular demand to it, simply bring me comfort. My cry then develops into what Freud calls a wish. I want particular things from you, and I am not necessarily crying any longer. I am able to use language, but I am always wanting. And my wanting from you sets up a situation of exchange, economics, and politics. What do I want? I want fundamentally to satisfy my body's demand, and I want you to I want to get you to respond satisfactorily to the demand I am faced with by my body. And this sequence, let's call that sexual. My demand to you becomes sexual to the extent that it's grounded in the demand on me being made by my body. So it's at this point in the sequence that we can get to, I hope we can get to, where Freud begins the case history of Paul. At the point where his demands, his outward facing demands to the world start becoming sexual, with the females who care for him, with his own body, with their bodies. And these demands on them mostly start to anguish him. Well, what is anguishing about these demands, about these wishes of his? And I think it's clear what's anguishing about them is that they are taking place in the presence of what Freud, in this case history, calls, he doesn't use the noun, they're taking place in the presence of interference. His demands are meet interference in the form of his father. So suddenly, in this sort of political sequence, it's no longer a situation of a dyad, my cry, whether you will respond, but suddenly we have a triangle. My demand for you in the presence of an interferer, the figure who well, interferes with the satisfaction of my demand. And at this point, Paul begins to suffer because suddenly he has an incompatible set of wishes. He wants to be satisfied, his sexual wish, and he wants no interference. And the only way he can imagine the absence of interference is the elimination of the interferer. And however, he also loves the interferer. And here is where Paul's anguish begins and never stops. His anguish never stops. He can't figure out a way to simultaneously move toward the satisfaction of his desire and move toward the elimination of the interferer. This puts him in an impossible situation, and it remains impossible until he meets Freud, and it seems to me even beyond his meeting with Freud. Okay, I want to pause there and then to see whether this introduction, which is sort of extra, is not directly in the text of the Ratman, see where it leaves you before we start making our move into the text. Can we pause maybe with some questions or reflections? I don't know if there are some, to have them, and I don't know for how long, but let's see whether there are things to say.
Dr. Shira has a question in the chat. What of the demands from the mind to the body? Can you make the inverse?
Well, I think the most dramatic example of demands from the mind to the body that is trying to reverse, in a way, it's a kind of political action, isn't it? That the mind might take against the demands of the body, insisting on its own autonomy, and rebelling against the position of having to serve the demands of the body. The most pertinent case of this is anorexia, in which the anorexic person turns against the demands of the body and insists on the primacy of the mind and on the political power of the mind to rebel. It's an act of rebellion, I think we could say, against this setup of the demand being only unidirectional from body to mind. And various forms of asceticism, all of them would be grounded in trying to contend with this persistently destabilizing fact of the demands originating in the body. And you can see that Paul is trying to do this as well in his way, by way of trying to shut down his own sexuality by way of various maneuvers and superstitions and denials, and he's trying to quiet those demands unsuccessfully, and whether anorexic people can do it successfully or not. But you can see that this could be a life project to locate your own subjectivity right there at the interface between body and mind, and have it be a lifelong project to modulate and regulate and maybe even equilibrate that set of exchanges. I think Freud would be very pessimistic about the chances for success of somebody who would want to reverse that direction. Are there other questions or comments so far?
Elias asks if you might go over the triangle once more.
Sure. I think initially in this frontier between body and mind, there are only two elements, body and mind. But the moment that I, who might be working to satisfy the demands of the body, the moment I interpret my incapacity to satisfy those demands, the moment that happens, a triangle can emerge. And I can hold the third party responsible for my incapacity to satisfy those demands. So that I'm calling the third party there the interferer. And for Paul, that third party takes on form in the form of the Father. But it's not only for Paul. The place of the Father in the triangle is famously there in Lacan and Freud and kind of everywhere. The Father is the figure occupying the role of the interferer. I hope that functions as a way of laying out the triangle.
Elias, is that good? I can't see you
Yeah,
correctly.
yeah. Thank you. I mean, I guess I was trying to like map the figures onto like the angles of the triangle onto like specific characters in the Ratman, or like trying to figure out whether like it was that kind of setup, or if you were kind of implying like an Oedipal story about like, well, like we don't get into this, but there's, you know, the mother who is the source of the potential satisfaction, and then the father is the interferer. But it sounds like you're saying that there's a kind of, you know, a triangle that can be like seen in the Oedipal story, but a different version of the triangle that can be seen here, if that's right.
Well, I mean to say that the Oedipal story, as commonsensically received, would be placing three characters on top of a structural triangle. And it's the structural triangle that would be present immediately once drive is in place, once the demand is placed on my mind to satisfy my body. The moment that I can't do that, I am one figure in a triangle. And the third figure there is that which is responsible for my incapacity to satisfy the demand. It could be a part of myself. So instead of a father, it could be my weakness, or it doesn't matter. I mean, it matters experientially. It doesn't matter structurally. It's just that there is the wish for satisfaction, the image of the satisfying figure, and the image of the interfering figure. It's these three figures that constitutes the triangle. And I see a question here. Can interfere also not be oppressor in a larger socio-political stance? Yes, yes, of course it could be. But it seems to me oppressor would refer to, in a way, gratuitous, supplemental interferer, beyond, how can I say, beyond structure, gratuitous and potentially eliminatable. But I think for Freud, the grounding triangle is one in which the interferer can never be eliminated. The excess, the gratuitousness can be eliminated. I think, but and here, you know, one can spot a sort of melancholic strain in Freud, and I think it's one of the things that drove me mad reading the Paul case, because I think in this case Freud forgets his own melancholy. He in wrapping it up the way he does, in bringing it all together, and you know, at the end of season 6, we see all the pieces fit together perfectly in this figure of the rat. It looks as though Freud and Paul have achieved satisfaction. The instability vanishes. It works. Everything is brought together, and you have almost the Freud and yeah, I see some electric gratuity. Yes, Freud and the Rat Man, Freud and Paul, have become a dyad capable of satisfying each other, and I think this is part of what is maddening about reading the case, because I think it does efface the most powerful, I don't know about a very powerful element of psychoanalysis, that is its fundamental melancholic bent, in which this kind of dyadic mutual satisfaction is not finally possible. So.
And then maybe it's worth just saying that Ratman has a special historical status where Freud was also trying to prove that psychoanalysis worked in a case study.
Exactly.
Gives us that season 6. So there's also like a material pressure here.
Yes.
It's like put up or
Yes,
shut up.
exactly.
It's 1909, man. And
Yes.
so we have
It's
Ratman.
absolutely right. So in a way, Hannah, that's I was.
We have another.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, let me just piggyback on what you've just said. In that sense, Freud and the Rat Man are in a relation where each one is using the other for cure. The Rat Man cures. Freud needs a story like the Rat Man's to prove something. The Rat Man needs Freud and the stories that he will provide to prove something. And so each of them is there unwittingly to provide narrative satisfaction to the other. And at the end of season 6, they can both walk away saying, see, I'm free, I'm successful, I've done it. I think that's what you mean, Hannah, something like that.
Yeah, and totally. And Alexa?
Hi, yes. obviously political can mean lots of different things in different contexts. And so I just wanted to get an understanding of, and it's probably maybe too big, what you mean when you say political. The point when I wrote it in my note was when you were talking about the second frontier, about the mind making a demand on the external world, and how a political relation is established immediately. What does political mean in that context? Thanks.
The external world can slap me in the face and tell me to shut up. And that would be a political act on the part of the external world. And upon being slapped in the face, I might bite the hand of she who or he who slapped me, which would be my effort at a political response to this political act. And I'm using the word political to refer to power. And I think what for Freud, when he says that the cry is the founding communication for all moral motives, I think what he means is something like Levinas or some in that direction. The only way that the cry can be responded to generously is to give priority to the satisfaction of the crying person over relations of power, to supersede power and replace it with recognition or love or in that direction. But Freud is not. You can see in the Rat Man. It's interesting, just to go with this a little bit more. At one point, when Paul is trying to return the money to the post office lady, and he gets so flummoxed, and it becomes 11 p.m. in Venice, and he's wherever he is, and he's done this kind of ridiculous zigzagging of a day. He goes to a friend's place, and Freud writes, I guess Paul says to him, and the friend brought him calm. And later on, Freud says, in a second situation, Freud says to Paul something like, you know, I have a very high opinion of you. And the effect of that is that Paul feels very pleased, great pleasure at that. Now, Freud makes nothing of these moments in which a second person has the power to bring calm, or a second person has the power to cause great pleasure. That is, in this case, the second person bringing calm or providing responsive pleasure has no place in the theory at all. There is no place for the second person being anything except an interpreter, a site of satisfaction, or a site of interference. There's nothing like holding or generosity or responsiveness. It's not there. And I think the fact that it's not there has did lead many people subsequently to try to make a corrective to this early Freudian notion of psychoanalysis. And the corrective made by many, Klein, Winnicott, Bion, the series of people who follow, the corrective is to be able to start theorizing that the second person has relational powers, that in relation to a second person, something can happen which is other than satisfaction of a wish and other than interference. And this other than gets generally called relational. And there, I think, is something not quite rawly political. So I see another question emerging here. It's interesting to me that the case outlines, and then today we're going to solve the condition. Oh, Mary McGuire, is there a question? I can't quite tell. I think it's interesting. Yes, CBT and what Freud is doing, these efforts at solution. I can't tell whether there's a question mark, but I can't tell what your question is.
Just if that is resonant.
Is it resonant, what you're saying? That's what you're saying? That's what your question is?
I guess so.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this effort at solutions just to try to keep in mind the political dimension of what we're talking about. It's a kind of liberal solution to things, isn't it? The solution. And I think for Freud, and I know for Marx, and I actually know for Freud, that the solution, the wrapping it up, the end of season 6 kind of solution is a violation of the most fundamental premises of both Freud and Marx. That where the aim is to achieve freedom out of necessity and to bring to the surface the repressed underlying story that has that undergirds necessity. And these tasks for both Freud and Marx don't have solutions. They have directions. They have directions, I think. They point in a common direction, common to both thinkers.
Don, I have a question about
Anything
the very kind of straightforward and crude appearance of economy in the text, which is the linguistic, the language bridge between the rat and the rate. And I wonder the extent to which this also, as a case in which Freud is fulfilling something that he needs in order for the project of psychoanalysis to launch. I wonder how he also needs to kind of justify the rate, the fact that this treatment exists as an exchange in this way, and the rate, the installment, becomes tied up in the kind of thought project of psychoanalysis in the question of inheritance, the way rat relates to inheritance and to the fee and to sexuality. And I wonder, I guess, how you see his analysis of the case also, somehow accomplishing some sort of justification of the fee that actually becomes it's like sort of when a therapist is late for a session and it becomes an opportunity to talk about abandonment for the patient, but actually the therapist is also just kind of late, that it is just a kind of violation of the frame. And in the same way, like, money simply has to be exchanged, but he treats it super symbolically, sort of. It's not just the way in which money is already symbolic, in the sense that it stands for something that it is not itself,
right.
But also it becomes even more. And so I'm curious if you can just say a bit more about yeah, that
Sure.
element.
Well, I think formally what money does in this treatment and in nearly all psychoanalytic treatments is it makes things conditional. That is, it changes, it triangulates the setup. It's not just me and you. It's me and you and a condition. And the condition must be met, or else we do not exist. So the dyad depends on the condition being met. So the condition occupies the place of the interferer, because absent the condition, this will be interfered with. So it seems to me that money, of course, is a very profound and nearly ubiquitous token of conditionality. Only given the condition of money exchange can the thing I want to happen happen. But I think also that money, I know from personal experience and also experience of other people, that the condition need not be only met by money. There are other means by which the conditions can be set. But I think that no treatment can be, and maybe even no relationship between two people can what would be the word? Can be three-dimensionalized without the trying, without the limitation of a condition in place. That is, dyads go mad. And I think the fee is an effort. The fee occupies the place that prevents Freud and the rat man, or Freud and any patient, from going dyadically mad with each other. In this case, I think Freud and the rat man kind of go dyadically mad with each other. I'm not that happy with the clinical outcome of this case. It seems to me that it's, well, I've said what I thought before. Does that address your question, Wendy?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks.
Okay.
Move on a little bit?
So,
Okay. One second. On Friday, today's Sunday, on Friday, I had this exchange, well, not quite exchange. I heard this from a patient. He and I are in the midst of the possibility of changing his fee, raising his fee. And this has been discussed for the last, not discussed, but on the table or in the air for maybe 6 months. So far, there's been no change. So he begins the session by saying that he got hit in the face today 3 times at his boxing gym, and that he could avoid getting hit in the face and go to a different coach, and this second coach would be kinder. But what's the point of that? Only if he gets hit in the face does boxing mean anything? Take away getting hit in the face, and you might as well not even box at all. Okay, and then he says, talking about the fee is like getting hit in the face. I don't want to do it. I love our relationship as it is. But when we add money to it, it's like putting a heavy weight on an unstable two-legged table. I want you to hit me in the face, and I can't stand the idea that you will hit me in the face. So I'm saying this as, how can I put it, as a contemporary contemporary rendering of the same kind of obsessional impossibility that Paul faces. My patient here says, only if I get hit in the face does boxing mean anything. Only if I get hit in the face does my relation to you mean anything. Take away the punch to the face, and what's the point? Add the punch to the face, and it's unbearable. And so he, like Paul, is in a situation where there's no possibility of a kind of compromise. And I thought here too, Freud makes a big and important point about the difference between obsessionality and hysteria, where he says that hysterics, and I think all neurotics except obsessionals, can find a way toward compromise in which getting hit softly in the face would solve the problem. Obsessionals cannot find their way to compromise. In a certain sense, they're purer, they're less compromised, their wishes are more naked and undiluted, unmodified. And in a way, I think that there's something more, I don't know, there's something easily admired about this obsessional incapacity to compromise. And at least I find it admirable. That is, where compromise, not in the moral compromising sense, but in the obfuscating, compromising sense, it seems to me that when we confront obsessionals, we're confronting, we're closer to nakedness, we're closer to direct exposure than we are most of the time. And even though, you know, obsessional people can seem very mad and disorganized, they're not disorganized, they're unorganized. They've never organized themselves. And I think in a sense, there's something that we have to appreciate about, we could call it an incapacity or reluctance or impossibility to hide the elements in a constructed whole, to keep the elements perceptible and visible, you know, to keep the wish to get hit in the face present along with the wish to be in non-violent, satisfying dyads, but at the same time to declare that absent violence, absent being hit in the face, absent merciless conditions, something about meaning vanishes. And I think that's there with Paul. And again, I think that the way Freud wraps up the case, he he buries elements, and in that sense works against the kind of bringing to the surface the underlying story that links Freud and Marx. I think one of the things also we should talk about here, compared to more contemporary versions of psychoanalysis, is that Freud basically has one idea here, and the idea is the irresolvable conflict between love and hate, and irresolvable conflict between the object of desire and the interfering object. But what he wonders, and we wonder, how is it so that for some people these elements are irresolvable, and for others they're less irresolvable, they're more resolved? And Freud answers the question by saying that there's something constitutional about Paul. That is, there's some extra element of sadism wrapped up in his sexual desire that irreducibly makes it impossible to reconcile with the project of becoming a civilized person. And this fallback position into constitutionality, I think, is also something that we should pay attention to when we're reading this case of Freud's, because then sadism becomes something beyond our capacity to analyze or pay attention to. It's a constitutional contribution to sexuality, and we can't get underneath it. And this, of course, I hope would leave us unsatisfied, because we don't want, well, not only we don't want, we don't believe that sadism is best understood as a constitutional given. This would depoliticize sadism and de-psychoanalyze sadism. And of course, Freud wouldn't manifestly want to do that, but he's doing it in this case. And I think it's important to underline that he's doing that in this case. Okay.
John, can we take
Yes, sure.
Stephen, go right ahead then.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, this is such a fascinating and enriching discussion. I'm going to see if I can sort of connect these two thoughts, but you talking about the patient and the punching in the face had me thinking about this part of the case, which reminded me of A Child is Being Beaten by Freud, where he's talking about, this is on page 204, where he says, "To my great astonishment, the patient then informed me that his mother had repeatedly described to him an occurrence of this kind which dated from his earliest childhood, and he had evidently escaped being forgotten by her on account of its remarkable consequences. He himself had no recollection of it whatever. The tale was as follows. When he was very small, it became impossible to establish the date more exactly owing to its having coincided with the fatal illness of an elder sister. He had done something naughty for which his father had given him a beating. The little boy had flown into a terrible rage and had hurled abuse at his father, even while he was under his blows. But as he knew no bad language, he had called him all the names of common objects that he could think of, and had screamed, 'You lamp, you towel, you plate,' and so on. His father, shaken by such an outburst of elemental fury, had stopped beating him and declared, 'This child will either be a great man or a great criminal.' The patient believed that the scene made a permanent impression upon him, as well as upon his father. His father, he said, never beat him again. And he also attributed to this experience a part of the change which came over his character. And I see this as very connected to this conversation that we're having about sadism right now. And then there's this long footnote about dreams that children have, which I think might even be like an early version of a child as being beaten. But it has me thinking also of this part of this case, and on page 224, where Freud is talking about the function of neuroses being that the neurotic patient and this person sort of enjoys the painful and unpleasant experiences that are involved in the resolution that is produced as part of the neurosis. And there's something going on in here where Freud is saying that's not just constitutive of subjectivity for the neurotic subject, but is sort of there for us everywhere, I think. But I don't know if that was, like I said, connecting a few separate thoughts, but I don't know if you would have any responses to that. This idea of like that there is a pleasure that the neurotic patient experiences in rehearsing their neurosis, which emerges from this sadistic relation.
Well, thank you very much. That's very interesting. The issue is pain more than sadism, I think. Sadism would be one mechanism by which pain is introduced into the scene. It isn't the only way pain gets introduced into the scene. So Freud's claim here, and I think it sounds as though you're inclined to go along with it, is that there is something, what Freud says, pleasurable. I would say something essential about pain, the place of pain in experiences of satisfaction. That is, what I mean to say is that the place of limitations on experiences of satisfaction and the relation between limitation and pain. So it's only, I think, with the inevitable recurrence of pain that satisfaction is really possible. So pain then is constituent to satisfaction. And from there, you can say, oh, well, that leads to a child as being beaten. That leads to masochistic fantasies. That leads to exigent sadism, Avgi Sakatopoulou's new title. That leads to various things, but I think underneath all of that is the structural necessity for limitation and the fact that limitation is inevitably registered in one's mind as having a painful dimension. It could be the product of the interferer. We can attribute, what is the source of limitation? Well, we can attribute to this and that, but I think what you're saying is that we need it. We need limitation we need pain in order to seriously experience pleasure. And then we have various stories that we can tell ourselves theoretically and intrapsychically to account for this need of ours. Am I resonating with your question?
Yes, and then also, and I know there are other questions, but I see, that this is part of Paul enjoying his symptom and kind of, I think,
Yeah.
Not that's why it's a working resolution. It involves this movement between doing something pleasurable and doing something painful, that I guess the goal of the therapy is to get rid of it. But also I think that's what's being kind of explored in these passages, is that the repetition of the neurosis involves this inflicting pain upon the self and enjoying that at the same time. And that's actually the resolution, much like the rat crawling into the anus is like this patient's focus on anal eroticism. But then also, of course, that would be a pain. That's a horrific scene that he's watching in the dream. And so, yeah, thank you for your answer.
And
Go ahead, Henny.
I was just going to ask Emily if she might contribute her question, and Seth, because we're starting to get many, which is exciting, but I also have my eye on the time because it's my job. Is that okay with you, Don?
Yeah, I'm just, my battery is running low. I may have to just go get a power cord in a second.
What?
But I have, let's hear Emily's question.
Emily, please.
Hey, thank you. This really comes back to some of the things that Wendy brought up and that are sort of in the chat at this point about some of the key words. And I just wanted to, before I sort of look at a couple of things, bring us back to this idea of, there's this wonderful point in the text on 2013 where the patient gave an indication of a connection between the words Ratten, R-A-T-T-N, and Ratten installments. And this question of, you mean I have to pay money for someone to listen to me? That question about whether analysis is really worth it, the question of its value, and the debt that's also being incurred by this thing called the unconscious, which keeps withholding something, which manifests as a drives demand on the body or on the mind of the other, but which is also very much a kind of message to the analyst, like, you owe me something, I'm not getting my money's worth. This very basic sort of pushback, and it's a lot seems to ride in the text on this this relationship between the installment. And so, for example, when, for instance, in reply to a question, Freud, told him the amount of my fee for an hour's treatment, he said to himself, so many florins, so many rats. Little by little, he translated language the whole complex of money interests, which centered around his father's legacy to him. That is to say, all his ideas connected with that subject were by way of the verbal bridge, Ratten with 20, Ratten 2. And, I'm not quite sure where the precise question is here, but it seems to me there's there's a question around the debt incurred by the unconscious on the one hand that can never be paid. And the other is the sort of transference of that debt to the analyst, the turning of the tables, and like, you owe me something and I may not be getting it. So that's a kind of comment question.
Thank you. I haven't seen you in a long time. Hello, Emma.
I know. Hi, how are you? We were on a Wolfman panel.
Yes. Yeah. I remember. We're really moving, making great progress. Is it worth it, is the phrase that I took most to heart in what you just said. So from so many florins to so many rats. So what we're interested in that phrase is, well, how did he go from florins to rats so quickly? So language helps him out there. German language helps him out. but to me, it's as though what he's doing there is going closer to the body. He's going from florins, which might be a little bit distant from the body, to rats, which are much closer to the body. So he's making he's moving meaning closer to its origins in the body when he does that. And I think that's the direction that psychoanalytic interpretation almost always aims to go, to interpret, to bring meaning closer to the body and therefore closer to its foundational stories of the sort that Jameson writes about at the beginning. So, is it worth it? I think is analysis worth it? Of course, that's a common question that people can have. But I also think it's the general question of being alive. Is it worth it? Is the whole damn thing worth it? And are you worth it? Is anyone worth it? What makes a person worth it? How do you even think about worth? What's being exchanged for what? Such that you can say, oh, that exchange wasn't worth it, or oh, this exchange is worth it. Well, the moment you say it is worth it, I can inquire to you, oh yeah, what makes that worth it for you? It wouldn't be worth it for me. And then so we can't stop with is it worth it, because the word worth warrants the same kind of interpretation that money warrants. The whole thing just keeps. That's what I think is so demanding about this text. The moment you land on a word, its meaning sort of falls apart right in front of you, and then you have to suddenly you have two words instead of one, and four instead of two, and 16 instead of 4, and so I think that the problem is that money offers a solution. Okay, here's this is going to be the cost. There'll be one cost, and then we can ask, okay, is that worth it? But it isn't one cost. It has the appearance of one cost, $50. Oh, okay, good. But $50, there's nothing stable about $50. It has the appearance of stability and has the appearance of worth. And I think the whole thing here with the Rat Man, nothing holds up. And that to me is what's so unsatisfying about the ending of the case, is that Freud sort of forgets that nothing holds up, and he makes it seem as though it does. And to go back to the question the man was asking before about pain, the pain part falls out, and you get this feeling of, oh, it has been worth it for both of us. And I don't know, it's not an experience that I have had as an analyst over the years, where at the end you shake hands and your portfolios have both increased to each other's satisfaction. It doesn't work.
But money talks.
Money talks. It also stops you from talking.
Thanks.
Seth, did you want to ask your question, or would you rather we read it out loud from the chat? I saw you had your hand up before.
Yeah, I mean, if we have time for it, I thought that was a really nice place to end if people are pressed for time.
I think, Dawn, it's up to you, but
no, I can keep going.
yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, Yeah, my question was really sort of about drives and, especially in relation to your point about constitutionality. Drive does seem a bit like an immovable here and a bedrock, but at the same time, drive is a very tricky, promiscuous thing. It's partial. It's sort of indifferent to its object, or it's able to find an object in almost anything. So it's clear that there's something anal about Paul's drives. And it's not clear to me from the case and also from today, like whether there's any changing that. But in other words, in a sense, if he can't derive his anal satisfaction in one way, then he derives it in another. So he derives it in his misery too. In other words, the drive is equally employed, equally gainfully employed, no matter how happy he is. So I wonder if you think that drives are, or that his drive is changeable, or what is changeable about the treatment, or what can the treatment affect in the changeability of his drives?
Well, first I think if we stay close to the notion that the drive represents a demand on the mind for work coming from the body, I don't think we could settle with Paul's drives are anal. We would have to say Paul's drives are oral, anal, phallic, somatic, who knows, ocular. That Paul himself, maybe symptomatically, tries to resolve, let's say tries to resolve the kind of multiplicity of drives by, in a sense, asking anality to do all the work of orality and phallicity. Let's pack them all into anality. Let's pack them all into the rat, because the rat is anal, oral, phallic, all at once. So I don't think we could comfortably say, oh, anality, that's the ticket here. And when you ask about changeability, I think that we can reasonably ask of a psychoanalytic treatment that drive structure be distributed across all the erotogenic zones of the body in such a way that the workload is equilibrated, so that one is not necessarily burdened with having one's mouth do all the work, having one's genital doing all the work, having one's anus doing all the work, but that there would be a more equitable distribution of work across the body and from the body. I think what that ends up doing is to generate a freer mind, a mind which can deal with partial demands from mouth, anus, phallus, rather than trying to comply with the hypertrophied demand of, let's say, anality, which by virtue of it being hypertrophied can't really be met. And then you're in this crazed position of having to satisfy an impossible set of demands because the tributaries are obscured. And if you can unobscure them, you have a more, I don't know what the word is, equilibrated outcome. I don't know.
That's hugely helpful. That's really helpful and gets at the fact that I find most discussions of drive that try to categorize and classify drive to be in direct contradiction to everything else that's said about drive, which is that in fact it's extremely elastic and movable. So all of
Yes,
especially Lacanians
yes,
who are always like, there's 4 drives, there's the invocative, you know, like all that shit
yes,
doesn't gel with
right.
everything else that gets said about it. So thank you.
I'm glad you called it shit.
And that's the perfect place to end for Rat Man. Don, thank you so much. Don and everyone else will go again next week, same bat time or same rat time, same rat place, but we'll be with Emily Apter, who asked the penultimate question. We'll be focusing on fetish. We're reading a chapter by Emily on maternal fetishism that's in the drive now, a very short selection of Freud on the fetish in 3 essays, and a brand new introduction to a book on fetishism by Ben Kafka and Stefano Scarolanos. And we'll be so excited to see you then, and we'll save the chat and we'll pick up in 1 week. But for now, thank you all for joining. And Dawn, thank you so much.
Hannah, do you want me to stay on so we can talk, or come
Sure.
on a different link?
We'll go on a different link. Okay.
Okay, I'll close this one.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Bye.